I find this conversation fascinating.
Yeah.
Because if you look at, I guess, the history of trends in the world of fashion, you find it's always, brands come full circle. You look at a Kappa now, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
I recall when Kaiser Chiefs was still sponsored by Kappa.
Yes,
and
yes,
Kappa
exactly.
You look at a Puma.
Yeah.
You look at a Reebok, for
Yes,
instance,
yes.
that has done a rebrand going back to the branding that they had in the 1990s, I think.
Yes, yes,
even
yes.
earlier.
Yeah.
And I ask myself, surely our own brands
Yeah.
should be experiencing the same. I mean, surely a Kangol should be competing with a Lokshan culture if we are indeed going retro.
Yeah.
Why has that not happened?
Yeah, and it's a good question in terms of why at all it's not happening. Because the challenge that you find is that, the brands come in, they have a big hype, and then all of a sudden they trickle down, something happens, and the brand disappears, yeah? And it's many reasons, which we'll cover today, but the first one is really around understanding the relevance to your market. Sure. Because what ends up happening is that just because people are excited right now, doesn't mean therefore you just go with the product as is. So really you need to challenge yourself, how do I make it relevant to my customer base? What is it that they want? And more particularly, what is it that they like about my brand that I can actually strengthen over and over so that it becomes the thing that differentiates me at the end of the day? Because what ends up happening is the biggest mistake, right, is we look at competitors. What are competitors doing? And then you start copying, you start changing, you start tweaking. Instead of saying, but the customers wanted something that's unique about me as a brand, what is it? And let me make sure that I stick to it as a fundamental, right? Because my niche is my niche. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is then you see is what ends up happening over time, right? Is you need to also think about how do you actually build your business so that you can be sustainable. Because ultimately, in the beginning, let's be honest, right? You're selling a few ranges, a few lines. It's very easy to sort of make it up, even from your garage situation, right?
And then there's complexity thereafter.
And then there's complexity thereafter. And I guess for me, the big thing that's missing is how do you turn it from that thing, that thing that survives, just J, but then you're really turning it and you're saying, okay, fine, it's a proper business, right? Do my costs actually make sense? Do my margin make sense? And am I doing my branding and my marketing right? Especially because that has been evolving quite a bit in the last couple of years. Yeah.
I mean, I want us to maybe think of this particular conversation from a perspective that's quite interesting. So in electronics, they often talk about a product life cycle, right?
Yes.
And one would think there's also, for brands, there's a brand life cycle.
Exactly.
Do you get a sense that if you take, for instance, a Lokshan culture,
Yes.
that over a long period of time, that, in many ways, maybe their brand life cycle got stuck at a certain moment in the popular culture. Many people would say, around, say, late 90s, early 2000s.
Yes.
And that potentially they weren't able, I guess, to take that life cycle and ride the next wave of what became the popular culture.
Exactly. I actually spent quite a bit of time in Silicon Valley, right? Because I did my MBA there at Stanford. And so we're studying a lot around what happens with the cycles when you're looking at businesses. And in the beginning, there's that big hump, right? And if the market likes you, it's great. The problem is that people see that first hump and they think, this is it, I've made it. And you start spending all the money, right? And you buy the BMW and everyone...
Because people have to see that you made it.
Exactly, and everyone gets a nice house upgrade at home. And then you don't realize that that's actually what you'd be using to be reinventing the business. So there's definitely a cyclical element to it. And a lot of the brands, I mean, especially startup, right? The majority of them, they don't survive. So a lot of them don't survive that first hump and they disappear. So then you start looking at the guys, what changed and what was it different? And it's turning it around then to say, look, if this is a proper business, exactly how much money do I need to be able to make to sustain this thing? Now, how many units should I be producing? And also, where can I get the lowest cost? And that's the biggest challenge we have here in South Africa, because you find that we're not the best, right? When it comes to how do you produce the cheapest, the best product.
Low cost, mass-based manufacturing.
Exactly, low-cost, mass-based manufacturing. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with that, right? So if you're not the cheapest brand, for example, let's say you've got your margin and it's quite expensive, that's fine. So you don't have to go for the cheapest material. But at the same time, you have to make sure that you can consistently give the materials that your customers are looking for. That quality is quite important. But being able to sustain that on a cost basis is quite important. And for me, that's where the trap falls, right? Because also think of our histories and our backgrounds, right? We haven't been trained of the fundamentals of business. And we take them for granted. And at some point in the curve, you need to go back to the fundamentals for this thing to work.
I mean, let's take a look at, I like to think of Sun Goddess and Stone Cherry, and alongside the likes of Lokshan Culture and many others.
Absolutely.
all of these are brands, retail facing.
Yes, absolutely.
And yet, there's been differences in how far they've managed to make it into mainstream retail.
Yes,
so you would have seen a Stone Cherry and maybe a Sun Goddess.
Exactly.
Really trying to make it into the retail space, and probably a lot less for Lokshan culture.
Yeah.
How much would you say is the traditional and the conventional and the established way of doing business in retail?
Yeah.
How much of that has had an impact on, I guess, the demise or decline in relevance of some of these brands?
No, of course. I actually have a background in retail, and I used to work for what is one of the world's biggest retail group, right? Inditex, based out of Spain. And I worked with them in different countries, right? They own Zara and many other brands. And you look at someone like them and sort of how they remain sustainable, right? And you have to, if you're a small player trying to get bigger, you have to find a way to get to as many markets as you quickly can, and also take your costs down as quickly as you can. Because then what ends up happening is if you don't have that equation right, you lose it, right? So you mentioned the point about being traditional. There are parts of retail that you have to stick to when it comes to being traditional. If you want to go wide, you have to take the cost down. You have to be in more doors. You have to partner with, whether it's your big retailers, etc. You can't do the, like the tuck shop inyana mindset, right? Where it's like, you'll find me here, you'll find me there, but...
nowhere else.
Yeah, and nowhere else, right? I mean, it's a national reach. And also, we're quite privileged in South Africa that the online market is getting quite advanced. So you can actually reach, like I do some online orders of some of these niche brands, and they can get the product to you. So there's ways to getting to mass, but you have to go quite traditional in the way that you approach things, especially when it comes to the way that you produce and also the way that you manage your costs.
And more importantly, I mean, if you go into the traditional retailers, those models, be it of consignment or taking on risk or even, you know, the different models that you would have, they have massive implications on your cash flow. It goes back, I guess, to the question that you're raising. How do you keep those overheads down? How do you keep some of those costs down?
Exactly. And also renegotiating with the big players also. I mean, being privileged that we're in South Africa, you can say, listen, I'm a small player. Even better if you're a black business and say, look, fund my supply, right? I mean, they know you're a black business that's trying to survive. How do you make sure that you help in that perspective? You know, entrepreneurs are scared to ask sometimes. Like, they're literally scared to ask, can you pay me up front? Can you start with 10 stores? And then if I win with that, put me in 100, you know, or 50 or 100. We're scared to ask these questions. And all I'm saying is, go with that, you know, that bold approach, and you might actually improve your negotiation power.
And, I mean, for me, the other interesting part of this particular brand is the ability to capture what I would say is the zeitgeist at that point in time. If you take Stone Cherry, the ability to capture this idea, this assertion and affirmation of an African identity. And similarly, in the part of Lokshan culture, the ability to say, for decades we've been told that the spaces we come from can't produce anything. And now this is about turning that concept on its head.
Exactly.
For me, the question is, you know, is that model relevant and feasible in all contexts and across different times?
Exactly. And I'm an Afri-optimist, right? So I can already say that I'm a big believer that those brands need to go global. Now, what I've seen the mistake that we make, right, is in the beginning, we're not building a global brand, right? You're building something that's relevant to like Elokshini, or maybe a certain, and people get excited about it, right? But you should be saying, how do I make this thing global, right? Like I look at some of the brands coming out of South Africa. I think there's another one, Amakhosa or something they call themselves. And you look at these things, no one makes that kind of stuff anywhere in the world. So you've got a product that's globally relevant, but you're busy you know, like limiting your thinking, your vision to just this market here. And that's the thing that I would like to see change, because I think we should be bold, we should be audacious. No one makes this stuff, right? No one really does. And we need to own that space quite a bit, because what's going to happen is you're going to see these things coming out of China and other parts of the world.
As we've started to see already.
Copying our very same designs. And you ask yourself, but why are we not the ones doing that for ourselves, right? And if I can be as bold as to say that the post-apartheid era, right? In apartheid, we were stripped of our confidence, right? Now we need to own our confidence and basically say, no, I have the audacity to believe that this is a global brand and I'm going to make it a global brand. And that's it. Then you go from there, basically.
Let's talk briefly. I mean, we've touched on the mass market a lot, right? And the big issue that emerges there is cost.
Yes.
But let's talk about what underlies the brand promise when I go niche. When I decide, like Latuma Ngokolo has done with to say, look, guys, you're not going to find this thing in Mr. Price Buffet. You're not going to find this thing in mainstream retail. My market is niche, my market is designer, and my market is certainly the affluent segment of the marketplace.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the approach there is very different, right? So everyone can aspire to go to obviously mass, but then you've got a lot more noise, a lot more competition. The privilege that these brands have, you can actually own a very small space. You can, right? Especially get your price up, get the quality right, and it's very, very unique from that perspective. Now, in that space, though, you need to understand that the relationship with your customer is much, much more intimate. It's much, much more personal, right? Because why would they pay the premium, and why would they come to you versus other people? Now, it goes back to this whole thing around, you know, not copying what the competitors are doing, but sticking to your niche, as I was saying in the beginning, because that's what they're buying from you. And don't lose that essence, whether it's 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, because that's what happens now. We watch, we see, and then all of a sudden you're not customizing to the very niche that you build yourself towards, basically.
I want us to pause there for a second, Zipho, and take a quick break.
Yeah.
On the other side of the break, we'll touch on a few other brands. And I want us to compare and contrast a few experiences here, see what that can teach, not only entrepreneurs that are working in the textile sector, but brands across the board, because I think the conversation we're having is not just about textiles or a particular sector, but it's about how do you maintain your brand promise across, I guess, different phases of the life cycle of that particular brand. After the break, we continue with our conversation. Remember to send us your questions, and you can tweet us on our handle on @405, I should say, business_. You can also send us your comments on WhatsApp. Messages on 072 110 5584. We continue with the Bakai edition of Start